Good morning. Happy Sabbath. So before we begin or get into our sermon, we thought it might be interesting to tell a little of the story of the things we went through preparing this sermon.
It all started in a Home Depot parking lot. As we were driving in, our mom was talking to us about many things, including preparing another sermon. And my dad already had a date for it 5 weeks later, which was today. And all the time during Home Depot, I was so nervous, like almost more nervous than I am now.
That was on a Sunday. About the middle of that week, so Wednesday or Thursday, when I was having my personal devotion, I happened to read the book of John, chapter 12, up to chapter 17 about. And I was very impressed by what I read and touched by what I read and thought it was very interesting. Well, that next Monday, just over a week after we found out we had to preach another sermon, our dad left for Florida. And so we are home without a car because we only have one car. And our mom, for morning worship that day, started talking to us about what we're going to preach about. And so Noelle and I had different ideas. And we finally settled on reading John because I read it the previous week and I wanted to read it again and consider it for our sermon. So we read John, and when we finished worship, went on with the day. Well, later that evening, I got into an argument with my mom, and we argued for about 2.5 hours. And I was bringing every reason I could think of why I didn't want to preach, why I couldn't preach, why I shouldn't preach. I was thinking of everything and bringing them and trying to convince my mom I couldn't do this. And my mom, is really hard to argue with her. She was bringing every reason she could think of why I could preach, why I should preach, and why I had to preach. No option. So finally I gave up 2.5 hours later, and I said, okay, I'll preach for you. What is our topic? And out of the blue, I just mentioned, hey, what about this, a topic in Revelation? And my brother and my mom, they said, yeah, we can consider that. And we started talking, and then all of a sudden, Noah mentioned something in Revelation, and all of a sudden something clicked in my head. Hey, this point that he brought out in Revelation, it connects with John perfectly. And so I mentioned that. And then something clicked in Noah's head, and we kept on going back and forth. Hey, this point and this point connect. And we ended up going to sleep way past our bedtime that night, around 11, because we were so excited discussing this. And at that point, it wasn't our parents forcing us to preach. We actually wanted to preach because it was very clear that God had made me read John the previous week and made Noah mention what he said so we could find out about this topic that we were wanting to study now. So we ended the evening on a very high note.
But when you try to do something for God, Satan always tries to discourage us, doesn't he? The next morning, my mom and me were sleeping while Noelle at about 5:30 went to go get a drink of water. And she came and told us that we had absolutely no water. And I don't know if you know my mom without water, but she went nuts. And so I thought, okay, maybe it's the controller. It maybe got hit by lightning because it was stormy the past day. And so I went down and I tested it. It was working. So I called my dad because he was in Florida, and I asked him what could be wrong, and he said, oh, maybe a wire broke down the hill. So we went down and hooked up a car battery to the pump, and it still didn't work. So my mom went nuts again, and
She thought it was an easy fix, and it apparently wasn't. We had to pull the pump now.
and so we went up to the house. We didn't eat breakfast. We did worship, and we went out and pulled up the pump. And so the motor compartment was full of water. So we had to drain out the water, and the brushes were all corroded, so the wires were like literally dirt. And so we had to redo everything, and then When we thought we had it fixed, we put it in, and then the connector was corroded, so we had to redo the whole connector. And then we thought we had everything fixed. We tested it, and we dropped it down the well. And I don't know if you know what, I forgot the name, but it's this connector. It's at the very top of the well, but we tried to push it in, and it got stuck halfway through.
It's about 2.5 feet below the top of the well pipe, so you can't see what you're doing when you're pushing it in.
So we thought, oh, maybe something stuck, so we kept on pushing it, and then we decided we had to pull it out. We tried to pull it out, and it wouldn't come out. Now, my mom knew that we almost had water. Now the pump wouldn't go in, and she got really, really depressed. And so she went off, and Noelle and me looked at each other and were like, we got to get this out. So we yanked on it as hard as we could and finally popped it out. And we yelled at her, and she came, and she was obviously happy again. And we made sure nothing would get stuck, and we put it back in, turned it on, and water just came out from between the two connectors. This rubber ring here wasn't there.
And that's when we realized that's what was stuck. That's why we couldn't put it in the well, which means it was at the bottom of the well. And we didn't have a car. We called our dad, and he said our neighbor wasn't coming, so he couldn't help us get another O-ring. So my mom really went crazy. So we're sitting next to the well. I was sitting right next to the well. The well pipe is right here. My brother's standing right there. My mom's standing here, and I'm holding the phone. We're talking to our dad. And our well has a bunch of wires, and I didn't know, but my dad told me that the bundle of wires that's wrapped around the well is actually wire that was struck by lightning and got burned up. So there's this tangle of unused wire right next to the well. Very, what do you say, matted? Not matted. Twisted and tangled, very close. So I looked down, and for no reason, my eyes just fell onto the well, on this wire tangle, and I see a rubber ring. And it was hanging in a place where only a human hand could have put it. And I pulled it off, and it was broken, actually. And I could see pinch marks on it where it must have been pinched as we were trying to push the connector down. And I held it up, and I said, "What's this?" And my mom and my brother just looked at it. We were all shocked. And so we told our dad, "Hey, we found the connector, bye-bye." We hung up, and we're like, how did this get here? There's no way it could have gotten there. Because when we pulled the pump out of the well, we pulled it to the other side. So even if it fell, it wouldn't have been there. It would have been on the opposite side in the leaves. And even if we pulled it onto the other side, where it was when I found it, there was no way that rubber ring would have opened up and gone where it was. And the pinch marks also, the pinch marks on the rubber ring, it fell down into the well for sure. There was no way that it fell around in the leaves or anywhere. It was at the bottom of the well. And when we were praying, because after we found out the O-ring was gone, we were praying. We need water. We can't survive for the rest of the day without water. My dad won't be home for another 2 days. We prayed, and we found the rubber ring, clearly put there by God. There was no way that it was there by chance. So after we fixed the well, we were eating lunch and drinking water. We knew, man, we don't have a choice now. We gotta preach, because clearly God has chosen this topic that we're gonna preach, and He brought us through this difficulty after that Satan was trying to discourage us with. The main thing that got us started studying out this topic was when we are reading John chapter 12. It says in verse 1, Jesus, 6 days before the Passover, the one that he died on, so Friday, he went to Bethany, to Simon's house, and he ate there, and that's where Mary washed Jesus' feet, right? When we saw it said 6 days before the Passover, we realized, hey, there's a time frame here. I wonder what goes on this week before Jesus dies. And so we researched it. We went between all 4 Gospels and went to the Spirit of Prophecy. And we pulled together a timeline of everything that happened the week before Jesus died.
So first, 6 days before the Passover, on Sabbath, Mary washes Jesus' feet with her tears and wipes them with her hair and anoints both his head and his feet with a very expensive ointment, as we know the story, right? And then Judas got upset because he wanted the money. And when Jesus rebuked him, he got even more upset, and he decided to go to the high priest and offer to betray Jesus. So he does that on Sabbath.
6 days before the Passover. 6
Yes.
days before Jesus died.
And then the next day on Sunday, 5 days before the Passover, Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey in the triumphal entry, Matthew 21, 1 through 9.
Oops. Then on Monday, Jesus, he goes into Jerusalem. And as they're going into Jerusalem, because the previous day on Sunday, after he rides into Jerusalem, he takes his disciples and goes back to Bethany and spends the night so the people in Jerusalem cannot crown him king. So they spend the night in Bethany. Monday morning, they come back into Jerusalem. And Jesus sees a fig tree. Everyone remembers this, right? He sees a fig tree with a lot of leaves. He goes up and there's no fruit. And he curses the fig tree. Everyone remembers this, right? Then they go into Jerusalem. Jesus comes to the temple and he sees these money changers and he casts them all out. This is all on Monday. Then this is 4 days before the Passover. Then on Tuesday, Jesus goes into the temple and teaches again. And the things that he teaches are quite interesting. Oh, but also on the way, when they spent the night in Bethany again, they come back into Jerusalem and they see the dead fig tree. And Jesus uses this as an opportunity to teach his disciples. Then Jesus goes into the temple and he's teaching. And the priests are obviously angry with everything Jesus has been doing. He rides into Jerusalem in triumph, and all the people are attracted to him, not them. And they are angry that he cast them out of the temple once again. So they are plotting how they can trap Jesus and decide that they might try to entangle him with his words. So they go and ask him, what is the authority that you use to do these things? And do you guys remember what Jesus said? He asked them a question. He didn't reply. He asked them another question and asked, John, was John's baptism from heaven or from men? And we know they couldn't answer this question. And so they're defeated in that purpose. They can't answer because otherwise they'll either receive the condemnation of Jesus or they'll be reproached by the people for their denial of that John was not sent by God. So he uses this opportunity. Jesus uses this opportunity, their ignorance, their professed ignorance, to teach. And he tells the parable of the 2 sons, in which the father asks both sons to go work in his vineyard. One son says, yes, father, I will go, but doesn't go. The other son says, no, I will not, and then goes anyway. And then also, after he tells that parable and shows how it represents them, the priests, he tells the parable of the wicked husbandman, in which the owner of the vineyard lends out the vineyard to husbandmen and goes off into a far country. Then when the time of fruit comes, he sends his servants to receive the fruit, but they kill all of his servants. And finally, he sends his son, but they kill his son also. This is Tuesday, 3 days before the Passover. Wednesday.
So on Wednesday, first the Pharisees question Jesus on taxes, where they ask, should we give tribute to Caesar or no? And he answers, give unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and to God the things which are God's. Then after this Pharisees are defeated, the Sadducees question on the resurrection, where a woman had 7 husbands, and they asked him, so who will be the woman's husband after the resurrection? And Jesus answers and tells them that they're wrong. They don't know. The things that happen now aren't going to continue past the resurrection. Then the Pharisees ask Jesus, which is the greatest commandment? And of course we know that he told them the 2 main commandments on which all the law hangs. Then Jesus uses this opportunity, because they couldn't say anything to his answers, to ask them a question. And he asked them, whose son is Christ? And they answered, he's David's son. And he said, then how does David call him Lord? And they couldn't answer that. And then he goes on to pronounce woes on the Pharisees in Matthew 23. And while we don't know if it's during the woes on the Pharisees or right after the woes on the Pharisees, but he sees a poor widow casting in her 2 mites as a gift and commends her because she gave all that she had.
From her heart willingly.
And then, as he's leaving the temple, never to come back, he sees the Greeks in the outer court that want to speak to him. And while he's talking to them, he says, Father, glorify thy name. And God speaks to him from heaven and says, I have glorified it and will both glorify it again. Then he goes to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples ask him, because he says that not one stone shall be left upon another. His disciples ask him, when shall these things be? And he prophesies about the end times and the destruction of Jerusalem in Matthew 24. Then he tells the disciples 3 parables: the parable of the 10 virgins, the parable of the talents, where the king had 3 servants, and he gave one of them 5 talents, and the other one 2 talents, and the other one 1 talent. And the ones that had 5 and 2, they multiplied their talents, and the one that had 1 did not. And then he tells the parable of the sheep and the goats, where he commends the sheep for doing good to their brothers and sisters, and he denounces the goats for just caring about themselves and not caring about anyone else except themselves. And this all happened on Wednesday, 2 days before the Passover.
Now, before we go on, is it confusing? Like, have you gotten lost in this train of events, or is it clear? It's clear? Okay, so we can go on now? Okay, so the next day, on Thursday, everyone should know what happened on Thursday. It's the day before Jesus died. Jesus washes the disciples' feet before they have the Last Supper together. Then they eat the Last Supper together. Judas realizes that Jesus knows that he is the betrayer, so he goes out to go to the high priest and get the mob. Because remember, the previous Sabbath, just a few days before, was when he betrayed Jesus, right? He promised the priest that he would betray Jesus into their hands on the previous Sabbath. And so now, on Thursday, he goes out and actually gets the mob and the priest to go actually arrest Jesus. And then once Judas is gone, Jesus talks to his disciples, and what he says can be found in John chapter 14, 15, 16.
17. 17 too.
17 is the prayer.
Oh.
And we know many of the famous Bible verses are found in John chapters 14, 15, 16, such as, let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. Amen. In my Father's house are many mansions. And he says, abide in me, and ye are the branches. I am the vine, ye are the branches. If you do not abide in the vine, you cannot bear fruit. This is all found in John chapter 14. And he goes on to say in 15 and 16 about how persecution will come to them because they do not belong to the world, and says that it will come to a point that they will even kill them, Jesus' followers, for believing in what they believe, and they will think that they are doing God's service also. So he's warning his disciples. And also, during this whole time, he constantly emphasizes that they must abide in him. And it's interesting to note that this was happening all before they go to Gethsemane. He's trying to prepare his disciples. Stay in me, watch. We will be persecuted because we are not of the world. And keeps on warning them. And then, as they go out from the upper room, he prays for his disciples in the prayer found in John 17, which I'm sure many of you have read, where he says, Father, I have finished the work that thou gavest me to do. And he prays for his disciples and says, Father, help them to be one even as we are one. I and you and me, and them in us also. He prays for his disciples, and then he goes to Gethsemane. And when the disciples should be watching and praying, they are sleeping, unprepared for the time of trouble which is about to come.
On Friday, early in the morning, just after midnight, the mob comes and takes Jesus and hands him to the high priest, where he is tried first before the church, and then they hand him over to the state, and they work together to bring out his death. Then he's crucified, and then as soon as he dies, the veil is rent from top to bottom. And there was a great earthquake, and the tombs of many of the saints opened up and they rose. And then his disciples took him and buried him in Joseph's tomb, where he rested through the Sabbath. And on Sabbath, while Jesus was in the tomb resting, the disciples hide in the upper room for fear of their lives. And of course, we know that on Sunday, he resurrected triumphantly. Now, I'm going to go over the whole week again, looking at in a wider, more big picture. So first on the first Sabbath, Mary anoints Jesus and washes his feet with her tears. And then on Sunday, there's the triumphal entry. On Monday, he sees a fruitless fig tree, that's not yet, nothing. He sees the fruitless fig tree and then casts out the money changers. And then on Tuesday and Wednesday, he's trying to tell the apostate religious leaders of the time what they're doing wrong. On Thursday, he's preparing his disciples for a time of trouble that is about to come upon them. And then on Friday, he gets killed and then is tried first before the church and then the state. And then the disciples go into a great time of trouble where they don't have their master with them. And then he resurrects triumphantly on Sunday morning. Now, isn't it interesting to note that on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, Jesus is trying to reform the apostate church of the time. And we're going to go we're going to look a little closer into the week right now.
Is it working? There. Well, our sermon title is A Prophetic Week. Do any of you see any patterns in what happens before Jesus dies? Anything related to prophecy that you've read before or heard before in sermons? Does anyone see anything? Well, let's look at this in thinking of the church history as we look at this in closer detail. Now, Sabbath. Mary's act of washing Jesus' feet has a lot more significance than many of us realize. Because, you see, to buy that alabaster box of ointment, it cost Mary a lot of money. I don't remember too clearly, but I believe it was around a year's wages. So she had to sacrifice a lot of money to buy this box to anoint Jesus' body, right? Then she breaks it open, this expensive gift, she breaks it. And this perfume fills the whole room as she's anointing Jesus' body and washing his feet with her tears. if we look at it in a prophetic way, or not a prophetic way, if we look at it as a shadow of an event, do you see God sending the most expensive gift that you can buy in the universe, Jesus, to the earth? He comes and he breaks his body for us and he dies. Amen. And Ellen White summarizes it much more eloquently than I could ever say. So I'll read the quote to you. Christ told Mary the meaning of her act, and in this he gave her more than he had received. In that she hath poured this ointment on my body, he said, she did it for my burial. As the alabaster box was broken and filled the whole house with its fragrance, so Christ was to die. His body was to be broken, but he was to rise from the tomb, and the fragrance of his life was to fill the earth. Christ hath loved us, and hath given himself for us an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling savor. So God sent the most expensive gift to us, right? He poured out all of heaven in his gift. And if we look at it from a human perspective, with our human standards, we could say, what a waste, just as the people in Simon's house said, what is this waste of this expensive perfume? What Christ did for us, many people don't appreciate, but still God did it for us, even though it seems like a waste. So, if we look at church history, what marks the beginning of it? Isn't it Christ's death on the cross, his resurrection? So if this marks the beginning of the church history, what comes next?
The triumphal entry. As we know, right after Christ's death, the apostolic church was very vigilant in spreading the gospel all around the world. And it's represented by the white horse in Revelation, conquering and to conquer, just as Jesus came into Jerusalem as a king. Ellen White writes about this, the triumphal entry. Their questionings are silenced by a shout of triumph. Again and again it is repeated by the eager throng. It is taken up by the people afar off and echoed from the surrounding hills and valleys. And now the procession is joined by crowds from Jerusalem. From the multitudes gathered to attend the Passover, thousands go forth to welcome Jesus. They greet him with the waving of palm branches and a burst of sacred song. The priests at the temple sound the trumpet for evening service, but there are few to respond, and the rulers say to one another in alarm, the world is gone after him. Just like the apostolic church, spreading the gospel all around the world. So on Monday, first Jesus sees a fig tree, a fruitless fig tree, and he curses the fig tree. And Ellen White writes about this, and it's very interesting what she says. She says, that barren tree, flaunting its pretentious foliage in the very face of Christ, was a symbol of the Jewish nation. But they were corrupted by the love of the world and the greed of gain. They boasted of their knowledge, but they were ignorant of the requirements of God and were full of hypocrisy. The Jewish religion, with its magnificent temple, its sacred altars, its mitred priests, and impressive ceremonies, was indeed fair in outward appearance, but humility, love, and benevolence were lacking. Wasn't there a church that came after the apostolic church that had great churches or cathedrals and impressive ceremonies with mitred priests, and they make this great show outwardly, but they don't have any fruit within? And Jesus casting out the money changers, he was trying to cleanse the temple of those that were trying to sell salvation that was free from God to the people. Wasn't there a church that tried to sell salvation through indulgences and penance to the people? And this was right after the apostolic church, so it lines up perfectly. And this was 4 days before the Passover.
Now the next day, Tuesday, if you remember, Jesus is teaching in the temple. But on the way to the temple, as they pass the fig tree that he cursed the previous day, they see it has withered up and is dead. It represents this, what will happen if the tree does not produce fruit. Doesn't it remind you of a parable that Jesus told before of the tree that did not produce any fruit? And the master says, cut it down. Why does it cumber the ground? And the keeper of the garden says, wait 1 more year. Let me dig around it. Let me see if I can change it for the better and fertilize it and see if it brings forth fruit. And if it doesn't, then at the end of the year, cut it down. Doesn't it sound like that? So this tree represents this church. If they don't repent and bring forth fruit to the glory of God, they will be destroyed. Now, the priests also challenged Jesus' authority on this day. They asked him, who gave you the authority to do these things? And what does he tell them? He asked them a question. John's baptism, was it from heaven or from men? And then he rebukes them because the messages sent by John the Baptist to the religious leaders, the apostate religious leaders, were rejected by them. They would not accept the messages of God. So he rebukes them and says, you did not accept this. Therefore, the publicans and the harlots go into the kingdom of God before you. And then he tells the parable of the 2 sons, which very much, the first son describes this church very well. He says, Father, I will go into your vineyard and work. But he doesn't. He claims to be a worker in the vineyard of God, but he does not actually work in the vineyard of God. It's like the hypocrisy of this church is shown through all of these parables that Jesus tells in the week leading up to his death. Then he tells the story of the wicked husbandman. What happened in this parable? The owner of the vineyard is repeatedly sending servants, and he finally sent his son even. But what did they do? They kill every single servant. They would not accept the messages from God to reform, to give him fruit. Doesn't this sound very familiar? Then on Wednesday, he is again teaching in the temple. And they come and ask him, the Pharisees do, should we give taxes to Caesar or no? And Jesus says, you give to God the things that are God's, and you give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Right? The reason why the Pharisees asked this question, remember, is because they didn't think it was lawful to give taxes to Caesar. They were very resentful of the Roman rule over them. And so they said, don't give anything to Caesar. We as the religious leaders of the Jewish nation deserve both the tithe and the things that belong to the temple services and all of the things that they're trying to mix church and state, if you see what I mean, in a way, a shadow. And he says, you give to God the things that are God's, and also do not neglect to give the things to Caesar that are Caesar's. You keep these 2 things separate, church and state. And then the Sadducees, because the Pharisees are defeated, they say, and come and ask him about the resurrection. They had skewed ideas about the resurrection, right? They didn't actually believe in the resurrection, the Sadducees. And they are trying to make it sound like Jesus didn't know the doctrine well because he believed in a resurrection. So they asked him a question that to them did not make sense. And he showed them that they are wrong on the doctrine of the state of the dead. Then the Pharisees come and ask him, what is the greatest commandment? Hoping that he will say one commandment is greater than another. Or so they could make it sound like he said not to keep this commandment or that commandment. But he says, you love God with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your strength, and you love your neighbor as yourself. And these 2 commandments are the basis of every commandment in the Bible, correct? And what were these Pharisees doing? They were upholding tradition above the law of God. Doesn't it sound familiar? Then Jesus asked them, whose son is Christ? And they say, the son of David. But he says, no, he is God's son. Isn't there a church that says that Jesus is the son of a mere mortal only? such as Mary. They believe that Mary is almost greater because she is the mother of the child. Because, the son is not greater than his father. The son always reverences the father or the parents. It's not the other way around. And David called Jesus Lord. So he showed them how they are wrong here also. Then he pronounces woes on the Pharisees and condemns them for their hypocrisy, for their pretense of following God, but actually being rotten inside, just like the whitewashed sepulchres. And he contrasts them with the poor widow who serves God with all of her heart, even though she can only do so little bit. It's like a black and white contrast. The apostate system who try to make a big show of everything they do to God and show off what they do. And then this widow who quietly tries to throw in these two mites and gives it from her heart willingly. It's a big contrast, isn't it? So these 2 days, Wednesday, Tuesday, and then also Monday, what is happening? Jesus, with his remnant or little group of disciples who are true followers of God, you could say, because God always had a small group of true followers, are trying to work a reformation in this apostate church who are hypocrites and say they believe in God but do not. Doesn't that sound familiar? Have you ever heard of a period of 1,260 days in which there was persecution and an attempt for reformation? Now, the interesting thing is that also on Wednesday, when Jesus goes out after this period of reformation, he goes out of the temple into the outer court and he meets these Greeks. And do you know what he says to these Greeks? In John chapter 12, verses 20 to 36, he is talking to the Greeks. But something he says doesn't quite fit with the crucifixion, you could say. Because he says, "This voice came not because of me, but for your sakes. Now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the prince of this world be cast out." And he goes on to say, if I be lifted up, will draw all men to me. But when did the judgment start? Did it start when Jesus died? No. The judgment did not start when Jesus died. But Satan was cast out. He was no longer the prince of the world because Jesus won the victory over death and Satan. So he had a claim to the earth again. Correct? But he puts in, now is the judgment of this world. And as we are studying, it seems like this story is a dual, or it has shadows of another event in it. So it has both, just like Matthew 24 has the destruction of Jerusalem and the end times together, this has both the crucifixion and end time events in it. Do you see what I'm saying? And after the 1,260 days, didn't the judgment of the world start? In 1844. Then he goes straight out from there to the Mount of Olives, and he tells the prophecies found in Matthew 24. And everyone has read this, right? Matthew 24, very well known. Some of the things he says in there are quite interesting. He says the sun will be darkened, the moon will be turned to blood, and the stars will fall from heaven. Didn't these all happen after the 1,260 days? The chronology of the week before Jesus' death matches perfectly with the church history. He tells about the sun, moon, and the stars after the period of Reformation he was trying to work in the Jewish nation. And then he tells the parable of the 10 virgins, which we know points to 1844 and the Midnight Cry. And he's prophesying or showing the investigative judgment out on the Mount of Olives. And he tells the parable of the talents. What is the parable of the talents talking about? A master who gives his servants talents and goes away, and when he comes back, he judges them according to what they did with their talents while he was gone. Does this sound like the investigative judgment or not? And then he tells the parable of the sheep and the goats, which also show what were his people doing to each other among themselves while the master was gone. Were they treating each other as Christ would treat others? The sheep are reflecting Christ's character in this parable, and the goats are not. Aren't we supposed to be reflecting Christ's character before he comes, during the investigative judgment?
Now on Thursday, we have Jesus washes the disciples. Wait, are you?
Well, I feel like I'm talking a lot and my brother's not. But he wanted me to do the hard days. So, well, on Thursday, Jesus washes the disciples' feet. If you don't remember, before the disciples go into the upper room with Jesus, they were arguing among themselves about who was the greatest. They all wanted to have the highest position. And so they were filled with this jealousy of one another and this pride and this hatred. They wanted the highest position and they were battling for it. Definitely not a Christ-like character. And Jesus, when he comes in, Mrs. White writes that he saw their character and that it was not the character that they could have to commune with Christ. Like, they cannot commune with Christ with this kind of character. So he girded himself with a towel to wash the dust from their feet, and he desired by that very act to wash the alienation, jealousy, pride from their hearts. This was of far more consequence than the washing of their dusty feet. With the spirit they then had, not one of them was prepared for communion with Christ. Their hearts must be cleansed. Pride and self-seeking create dissension and hatred, but all of this Jesus washed away in washing their feet. A change of feeling was brought about. Looking upon them, Jesus could say, "Ye are clean." Now there was union of heart, love for one another. They had become humble and teachable. Except Judas, each was ready to concede to another the highest place. Now with subdued and grateful hearts, they could receive Christ's words. Isn't this how we're supposed to be? Preparing during the investigative judgment for that time of trouble so we can stand? We need this kind of character. And isn't it interesting that after he tells the prophecies that predict the beginning of the investigative judgment, he starts showing what you're supposed to be like to prepare for the time of trouble. Because you prepare during the investigative judgment for the time of trouble that is coming. And then they have communion together. And Mrs. Wright writes that this communion, because he said, "I will not drink this cup and eat this bread with you until I come again and we eat it together new in the kingdom." Each time the disciples partook of the communion, they kept before them, of course, Jesus' death, his burial, and his resurrection, and also the Lord's coming. Aren't we supposed to be keeping that before us continually? The great price that was paid for us, the gift of salvation. We're supposed to continually keep it before us and look for the second coming when our salvation will come. Then, of course, Jesus warns and comforts his disciples, like I covered some earlier. And everything he says in John 14, 15, and 16 applies to the end times just as much as it applied to the disciples before the crucifixion. He tells them they must love one another as he loved them, to the point that you will even give your life for one another. You must abide in Jesus, because if you do not abide in Jesus, you will not have his character and you cannot bring forth fruit. He warns them of this persecution that is coming. And he tells them that they will be killed for his sake, and that those that kill them will think that they are doing God good. He's preparing them for this time of trouble on Thursday, trying to change their character to be right. And then he goes to Gethsemane after he prays. He prays for his disciples and says that they prays to the Father that they can be one together. Before Jesus comes, aren't we supposed to have another Pentecost? Another time when we're all one in heart and mind together? Amen. So he comforts, warns, prepares his disciples. And this is all a shadow or a symbol of what we must be before Jesus comes, preparing for this in the investigative judgment. Then they go to Gethsemane, and when the disciples should be awake and watching and praying, they are asleep.
That was Thursday. Now on Friday, as I said, just after midnight, the mob comes and arrests Jesus. Then he is tried before this church and then the state. And we know that whatever they do to Jesus, they do to us, right? And so we know that later, when they try us before the judges, the church and the state will be working together to try to bring our condemnation. And then he's crucified on Calvary, and the veil is rent from top to bottom, and there's a great earthquake which opens the tomb of some of the saints. And we know from the Bible and spirit of prophecy that during the time of trouble, there will be a special resurrection of those who died in the three angels' message. And the veil being rent from top to bottom, in Jesus, when Jesus died, this represented the ending of the ceremonial services. But it's a shadow of a great work in the heavenly sanctuary being finished when Jesus at the close of probation. Then he's buried in Joseph's tomb and is resting throughout the Sabbath. And this plunges the disciples into a great time of trouble where they're hiding. I forgot to read this. This is Matthew 27:51 through 52. It's describing the veil being rent and the earthquake and the graves being opened. And then on Sabbath, when the disciples were in this time of trouble, they're hiding in the upper room for fear of their lives because they're afraid that what happened to their master will happen to them. And we will be hiding in the mountains, fearing for our lives because we're hiding from them that are trying to kill us.
And it's interesting to note that during this time that they are hiding, their master, Jesus, is not there. Same as us, during the time of trouble, we'll be hiding with no mediator in heaven.
And then on Sunday, everyone knows that Jesus rose triumphantly out of the grave, and he conquered death and Satan, just as he will conquer death and Satan and sin at the second coming. Now, isn't it interesting to note that we have from the apostolic church, the 1260 days, the investigative judgment, the time of trouble, and Jesus coming again, all in the week that Jesus died? We thought that was very interesting when we prepared the sermon.
And note that we are in this timeline on Thursday, the time when we're supposed to be preparing for the time of trouble. We already are past the time of the beginning of the investigative judgment. We only have the time of trouble to come now. We're just waiting. We're very close to the end now. And we have to be careful that we are not like the disciples who are sleeping when they should be watching and praying so they can stand.
So, was there anything that wasn't too clear, or do you have any questions or anything of that sort? Anyone?
You covered a whole lot of ground, and you did really good. But I'm sure there's a few of us that still a little bit of a piece here and there. But exactly which piece, I'm not sure. But you did a really good job. A whole lot, and then you're right, a whole lot did happen. Well, in the background, a lot of us gloss over it. We read it, we don't totally comprehend it, and I commend you for pulling that out.
Amen.
Amen. You did very good.
Thank you. While we were preparing the sermon, we also realized why God didn't lump all the four Gospels into one, easy to read, easy to figure out what's going on because he wanted us to study into it, to figure out all of these truths. He didn't want us to just read it and be done. He wanted us to study it. And in closing,
he did do it though in Desire of Ages.
Yeah.
But even if we read Desire of Ages, you still got to dig. He doesn't just give it easy to you. We got to do our part trying to look for truth and prepare. Because if you don't actually look, you won't know it for yourself. If you just have it easy, you won't know it. And just like in Sabbath school today, we have to be ready to give an answer for the reasons of our faith. If we don't study it and know it ourselves from like top to bottom the subject, how are we supposed to do that? This is why he didn't just put it easy right there. We have to dig for gems of truth.
In closing, we want to read a quote from the Spirit of Prophecy. We want to get in the habit of talking of heaven, beautiful heaven. Talk of that life which will continue as long as God shall live. Then you will forget your little trials and difficulties. Let the mind be attracted to God. Eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man, the things which God hath prepared for them that love him. And now may the blessing and peace of God rest upon you all, my brethren and sisters. May your lives from henceforth be lives of watchfulness and prayer. And if we never meet again in this world, may we meet around the great white throne to sing the song of victory together in the kingdom of God. Amen.
Our closing hymn is number 600.